Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for the Jessie Street Trust. I want to begin our session today just by acknowledging that wherever you are in Australia, we're all on traditional lands of First Nations people. This land was never ceded. And today I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wallumattagal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to start our webinar today just by paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us here this evening. I also want to acknowledge the great struggle for equality for so many First Nations people over so many years. My name's Liz Broderick. I'm the chair of the Jessie Street Trust, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting this, which is the second of our Jessie Street Trust webinars this evening. I just want to bring you up to speed on a few housekeeping issues before we get our conversation off and running. So you'll see that the chat has been disabled on your screen, but we are keen to get questions for our expert panelists tonight. And to ask a question, you can type your question into the Q&A box, which you can find at the control panel at the bottom of your screen. You've also got a button there where you can vote up particular questions, the ones that you're interested in, and we'll try and ask as many questions as we can, particularly those with the most votes. But tonight's event, we're keen not just to educate, but also to promote active allyship. So please, either during or after the event, please head to our website at the jessiestreettrust.org.au to find out what you can do to support Indigenous organisations working to the Uluru Statement from the Heart's request. Of course, constitutional recognition of and the equal rights of Indigenous Australians were core values for Jessie Street. They were values that she fought so hard for together with so many others in the 1967 referendum. And those issues remain at the heart of what the Jessie Street Trust focuses on today. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was graciously gifted to the Australian people on the 50th anniversary of that referendum in May 2017. And 4 years later, Indigenous people are still fighting for the implementation of these requests. The political and grassroots movement to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution has progressed since then. And of course, we've had the voice co-design process initiated by the Morrison government in 2017 and led by Tom Calma and Marcia Langton. They presented the first report to government in October 2020, and the process of consultation on the recommendations of the interim report was concluded just a few months ago in April 2021. And as you will probably know, the final report is now with the Cabinet. Importantly, the terms of reference for the co-design process excluded recommendations about constitutional recognition of a voice. But despite this, it didn't stop almost 90% of the 2,600 public submissions responding to the interim report from explicitly stating that they believe the First Nations voice should be constitutionally enshrined in line with the United Statement from the Heart, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So I just want to note that our submission was one of those calling for constitutional recognition. Now, there are different perspectives within the Indigenous community about how best the voice should be enshrined, what the first 100 days will look like. The good news is that tonight we're here and joined by three leading minds actively working to advance the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the lives of Indigenous Australians. And I look forward to hearing all the perspectives this evening, taking stock and envisaging a way forward for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians together. So the agenda for tonight is I'll hand to Danny shortly. He'll be our facilitator for the evening. Then we'll have our discussion with our two guests who Danny will introduce. And then we'll have closing remarks from Tanya Plibersek, the Federal Minister for Sydney and a long-time social justice warrior. and then we'll be finished by 7:30. But let me now introduce Danny Gilbert. You'll know Danny has been a long-time advocate for constitutional recognition. He's the co-founder and managing partner of Gilbert and Tobin, one of Australia's leading law firms, and a firm that's always had a huge pro bono practice. I first met Danny actually when he was an active member of a Supply Nation board, working to connect Indigenous businesses to buyers of services. And he's active on many boards. He's currently the chairman of the Cape York Partnership Group Limited and a director of a Business Council of Australia. And in recognition of Danny's work, in 2005, he was awarded a member of the Order of Australia for his service to the law, to the community, and particularly Indigenous Australians. So it gives me a great pleasure now in handing the floor across to Danny to introduce our speakers and get our conversation happening. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Liz. It's a great honour to be asked to participate in this forum today. I'm very grateful and feel quite privileged to do so. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, various lands on which we meet across the country, and let me join with all Indigenous First Nations people in their legitimate requests for a proper seat at the table in this marvellous country of ours, which will include recognition in our constitution, recognition that is meaningful, and recognition of the voice. With that, let me introduce our guest today, Tanya Hosch and Dean Parkin, both of whom I have known for many years and worked with. Tanya Hosch is a Torres Strait Islander and preeminent First Nations rights activist and leader. She was named the 2021 South Australian of the Year and is currently the General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy at the Australian Football League, the AFL. Tanya was a member of the Referendum Council that led the process and final recommendations that resulted in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, May 2017. In her time at Recognise, Tanya and the Recognise team amassed close to 300,000 signatures to express their support for Indigenous recognition. Tanya was also a key contributor to the creation of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, a foundation director of Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre and the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, and a director of the Indigenous Land Corporation from 2015 to 2018. In December 2018, she became a Goodwill Ambassador for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the UN. Welcome, Tanya. It's great to have you with us. Dean Parkin is a man I talk to every other day. He is currently the director of the From the Heart campaign, of which I am an active member as well. Dean is from the Quandamooka peoples from Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island in Queensland. He was involved in the negotiations leading to the native title determination in 2011 and continues to work with his community. He, as I mentioned, he's the director of From the Heart, and we are working to educate and advocate for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice to be enshrined in our constitution, and we'll say a little bit about what that actually means later in this conversation. Dean has been an independent management consultant. He's worked across the public, corporate, not-for-profit and political sectors. He's advised a range of clients on strategy, engagement and co-design, including the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Coles, the Referendum Council and Jarwin. He's a senior fellow of the Atlantic Fellowship for Social Equity and an ex officio member of the Business Council of Australia's Indigenous Engagement Task Force. So we have here us today two highly respected Indigenous leaders here today to speak of their support and how they are seeing the challenges that are in front of the nation, particularly, but perhaps not even exclusively, but particularly in relation to constitutional recognition. I thought, Tanya and Dean, we might kick off with you, Dean, because you're the person closest to this issue of the three of us, working in it every day. And I think if I can give a lead, I think the proper place to start with any discussion of this issue is the Uluru Statement from the Heart itself. That is the foundational document from which all of our activity and thinking is now formed. So with that brief frame, I'll pass across to you. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks a lot, Danny. And thanks a lot, Liz and the Jessie Street Trust, for the opportunity to have this conversation today. Just with the Uluru Statement, I think it's always important to note that the statement wasn't a new idea. It wasn't a new concept. It's very much part of a continuum of a long, long history of activism and advocacy by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over many, many decades. And my role in that was working with Auntie Pat Anderson, Professor Megan Davis and Noel Pearson as part of the Referendum Council that Tanya was part of as well. And I co-facilitated the regional dialogues across the country, 12 regional dialogues across the country, north, south, east and west, urban, regional, remote. And I had to stand at the front of the room and live capture what people were saying, their ideas and their hopes and their dreams, their cynicism about what was being proposed, and their cynicism that their views would be ignored yet again, as we've seen on many occasions in the past. But one of the themes that came through was that, and particularly the older people that have been around for a long, long time, have been talking about these issues ad nauseum, and they're not talking about them because they particularly want to be talking about constitutional recognition, or they want to particularly be talking about these big issues, but because of what's happening with their families and their communities and what they want to see for their children and their grandchildren, and in many cases great-grandchildren, wanting to leave behind communities, wanting to leave behind families, and wanting to leave behind a nation that has a rightful place for them in a way that potentially for some of them over the course of their lives they haven't been able to achieve. So I do want to acknowledge that the Uluru Statement is an old story. The people took it really seriously. Their obligation to contribute when asked this question. And the Referendum Council, the Uluru Statement process came about really asking this question of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because we've been talking about constitutional recognition for a long time. There's been a number of reports. Linda Burney was part of the 1995 rights recognition and reform process. John, there was the 99 failed referendum on the Republic, which also mentioned the preamble. John Howard mentioned it in 2007. And there's been this bipartisan commitment over many, many years to talk about constitutional recognition. But the Referendum Council and the Uluru Statement was really in response to the question, what does meaningful constitutional recognition look like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? So we went through that process of engagement and intense dialogue over about 6 months across those regions. And it all culminated at Uluru in May 2017. And, you know, the 4 days that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart was some of the most profound, challenging, heated, and important conversations that I've had the pleasure to be part of. And as a result of all of those conversations and debates, the Uluru Statement was created on the 26th of May 2017, and it's remarkable. It's 430 words. It's a very, very short statement, so I'd encourage everybody to read it. And it takes you about 3 minutes, and I'd encourage you to read it on multiple occasions because you learn more about it every single time. And I think just briefly what the Uluru Statement is, it does three things. There's a line in the middle of the statement that says, with substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. So the first thing it does is it says, this isn't just about fixing a hole or addressing deficit or disadvantage. If we get this right, we'll have a richer nation, we'll have a richer sense of identity, we'll think better about ourselves as Australians. So that's the first thing. The second thing it did is that it proposed three really key structural reforms. It said first there should be a voice, and that voice should have the guarantee of the Australian Constitution, a voice, an advisory body to Parliament to advise parliaments on laws and policies. The second thing it should do is that there should be a process of agreement making or treaties, which has been a long held ambition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the third thing which really arose through the dialogues. This wasn't a question that went to the dialogues. This arose through the conversations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, was that there should be a process of truth-telling, real truth-telling, deep, structural, institutional, cultural truth-telling about our nation's history. And then the third thing it did is, really importantly, and this is the most important thing for everybody on this conversation to realise, the Uluru Statement wasn't presented as a submission to government. It wasn't presented to a Prime Minister. We didn't go and present the artwork to then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. It was issued to the people of Australia. And so ultimately it's for the people of Australia to respond. And so that's why when we talk about our campaign, it is about absolutely trying to mobilise, in the campaigns that Tanya's been involved in previously, it is about absolutely trying to connect and mobilise and engage and empower the people of Australia to get behind and support this. So this isn't for us to sit back and wait for the politicians to do their work. It's for the people to move forward, and the politicians will follow. You're on mute, Danny.
I'm unmuted now, I hope. I might stop you there and pass across to Tanya. You were part of the movement. You were there, Tanya. How do you see the Uluru Statement from the heart? How do you think about it, and how do you think about that as the instrument to project us going forward?
Thanks, Danny and Dean, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's great to know that so many people would want to get on a webinar to discuss the Australian Constitution. My God. And huge thanks to Liz and the Jessie Street Trust for giving me an opportunity to talk about this. I haven't spoken publicly about this work for a really long time. You know, I worked alongside so many amazing people, some of whom are still actively engaged, others who are not. But when I think about the Uluru Statement, it reminds me to acknowledge where I am right now. I'm coming in from Adelaide on Kaurna country, which is not my country, but it was where I was born and where I've lived most of my life. When I think about the Uluru Statement, I think about it from a number of different perspectives. The first is an opportunity for a much needed moment of nation building. I now work in football and never thought I'd find myself there, so maybe constitutional change is possible. And I believe strongly in a universal need we all have for belonging. And I'm sure that's why a lot of people go to sporting matches, whatever the sporting code it is, because for that couple of hours, you know you belong. You're part of a tribe of people who all want to see the same outcome. And in Australia, the First Peoples of this country often don't feel like we belong. And that is perverse and something that must be fixed and can be fixed. And so you have to think about what is the infrastructure you need to address. Just like we look at infrastructure for anything else to keep us connected and safe as Australians, we need to look at the legal infrastructure of the country and think about how we make sure the first Australians never have to question if we belong. Now, changing the Constitution is only part of that, but it's an important part. And then I think about it from the perspective of our legislators and the people we elect to represent us in our federal parliament, who have this awesome power and responsibility to move this along. And I know from my time at Recognise that there was an enormous amount of goodwill politically across a whole range of divides. And that's important because Australia's never had a successful referendum without it. But what I also think about is the leadership that's required at that level. And if I was a politician, I would look at the Uluru Statement and I would see it as an amazing bargain, and I'd grab it and run with it as quickly as I can, because this is actually a pretty conservative series of asks. This is not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people asking for anything that is extraordinary. It is actually a pretty straightforward and pragmatic set of requests, and some really spectacular leadership to say, okay, we're pragmatic. We know that we're a minority in our own lands, but there are contributions that we need to make to help the country be better, but also to make sure that our own people are looked after so that we continue to be the oldest continuing cultures on the planet. So from a political perspective, I don't know why you wouldn't take this deal and run with it and take it to the bank now while you can, before we get bolder. And then finally, I just think about what it means for me as a mother. And I want my daughter, who I remember as a 3-year-old taking her to one of the roundtable meetings of the expert panel in Adelaide, and going into a shop afterwards and a shop assistant talking to her in baby language that my 3-year-old did not understand, and said, oh, what have you been doing? And my child said, I've been at a grown-up meeting with my mummy. And the shop assistant thought that was adorable, and then said, oh, and what was that about? And my 3-year-old daughter, Marley, who's now nearly 14, said, changing the Constitution. And she's nearly 14, and she shouldn't be waiting for that to still happen. It's not as though there hasn't been enough desire expressed. It's not as though we haven't seen time and time again polling numbers that tell us the majority of the country is ready for this change. And I want my child to grow up in a country and live her life in a place where she is respected for the unique status she has as carrying the bloodline of First Peoples. And it is a special status. It ought to be recognised, and it ought to enable our people to contribute to decisions that allow us to take more control over our own lives.
So, Tanya, thank you for those marvellous insights, really. I mean, it's a very powerful expression of the Uluru Statement, why we're here today, and the thoroughly unsatisfactory status or nature, position that we all find ourselves and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders find themselves in at this late stage of the development of this country. It's not good enough. So thank you for those words. Dean, we might flick to you and just take us through what's happened since then, and the juncture, the point that we are at now, and then I'll come back to Tanya for a similar kind of observations about that process so far, where we are today. Okay.
Thanks, Danny. I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot has been achieved since the Uluru Statement was issued 4 years ago. You probably wouldn't appreciate that by listening to some of the media reports and some of the commentary that sits around this. And I think that's a characteristic of the way that narratives sit around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led calls for change. There is a fairly negative, fairly deficit laden, and fairly cynical way of representing and in many cases misrepresenting what's actually happening. So one of the things, again, I'd encourage people to do is think about this with and approach these issues with a bit of a critical lens, and not just simply accept what you're reading in the newspapers on a day-to-day basis. So what's happened since Uluru? Obviously, there's been a pretty convoluted process. The statement was issued. The referendum council handed down its final report. And unfortunately, in October 2017, then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said that it wasn't going to happen and effectively rejected the very heartfelt call from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples without a lot of consideration and without going back to the people that were involved in that process and trying to find a way through. Nevertheless, I think even at that stage, there was a feeling that that was a little bit of overreach and that there was something fundamentally unfair about the way that the government at the time treated the Uluru Statement and its calls. So government then established a joint select committee led by Senator Patrick Dodson and Julian Leeser, basically going over the same ground that the mob went through, getting to the Uluru Statement from the heart, and effectively came to the same conclusion and said, with regards to the voice, there should be two things that should happen. The government should do a process of co-design to put the meat on the bones, to really look at the functions and the structure and how the voice would interact with parliaments and governments. And then the second recommendation from that process was that following that finalisation of the co-design process, the government should sit down and really consider in a really deliberate way what the constitutional and legislative arrangements might be to bring the voice to life. Those recommendations were agreed to in a bipartisan way by both Labor and the government at the time. And both the coalition and Labor took election commitments in 2019. The coalition government took an election commitment that there should be a referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition in this current term of Parliament. And Labor went slightly one step further and said that that referendum should also be distinctly and directly on the voice. So obviously with COVID and the impacts that had on all of our lives, the idea of holding a historic referendum, the first since 1999, wasn't possible in this term of election, but this term of Parliament. But I think it's really important to know that both sides of government, both sides of Parliament, the coalition and Labor have election commitments to a referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition, and those commitments remain. Minister Wyatt, as Liz said in her introduction, then facilitated a process led by Professor Dr. Marcia Langton and Professor Tom Calmer to do that co-design process. And as Liz said, substantial consultation process, 90% of the published submissions. It was an extraordinary response rate, 2,500 published submissions. And as Liz said, 90% of those are calling for the voice to be enshrined. As Liz also mentioned, the public polling over the years has been consistent on this question. We're sort of averaging, in our own campaign polling shows that, you know, between 50 and 60% of the Australian people would support a voice at a referendum. And those opposed, really importantly, are only about 15 to 20%. So we constantly hear, this is what I talk about in terms of reporting, we constantly hear that people won't accept it, it's too hard. You know, Australia's too racist to accept something like this. That's not what my conversations have shown, and it's certainly not what the polling and the data actually shows. The data actually shows that the majority of Australians are up for this. And interestingly enough, our polling also shows that those undecided, that sort of 25 to 30% of people that are yet to make up their mind, they're likely to vote yes when they hear about and understand what's actually being proposed. So there's a massive opportunity here. Ours is a campaign, and the call for a referendum on a voice is actually a campaign of opportunity, not a one of just trying to drag this thing unwillingly up the hill. So I think that's really important to understand. So the government, as Liz said, Minister Wyatt has received the report from the committee process led by Marcia Langton and Tom Calmer. We know that despite that, and despite the evidence, despite the polling, and despite the thousands of Australians who are calling for the voice to be enshrined, there has been a concerted push by Minister Wyatt and others involved in that co-design process to do away with the constitutional part of the voice, to do away with the call for a referendum, and simply legislate the voice. So to simply pass it through legislation like other previous bodies have done in the past. That's not what Uluru called for. So let's be really, really clear. The proposals to legislate the voice are inconsistent with the Uluru Statement from the Heart and are inconsistent with what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have called for through the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We know that because I know that because in my lifetime, on average, once every sort of 7 or 8 years, we go through this process over and over again. There's been committees and councils and commissions that are effectively voices that have been established. They operate for a couple of years, then they get abolished or discarded by governments. And we fall into this valley of kind of irrelevance for a few years. And then we try and do the process all over again. And you know what? I don't want to do that for the rest of my life, for the sort of 30 to 40 years that I have in trying to work on the things that I want to work on for my people. Having to go through that every sort of 7 or 8 years just makes me tired thinking about it. And so that constitutional protection, the need for it to go to a referendum first, to give it the constitutional guarantee, is not just imperative, but it is essential for this thing to actually work. And it's essential for the country if we want to respond genuinely to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We have to go through any sense of legislating this previously, and without that constitutional enshrinement, it's giving up on Uluru. And I think the Australian people know that and are not willing to accept that at this point in time.
Thanks, Dean. Tanya, how have you seen, I know you're not involved in this movement, as you were front and centre of it during the Recognise campaign, which was a different remit that you had, but nonetheless closely involved and keenly committed. How have you seen it unfold since the issue of the Uluru Statement, the sort of things that Dean's talked about, the so-called third chamber from Turnbull and arriving at where we are today?
I think what I would like to say about all of that is I think one of the most effective things you can do to destroy an ambition of a collective group of people is to divide that group of people. And I think there's been a lot of politics in play that has been very successful at that. And I think that makes a difficult task even harder. I think that when it comes to work like this, and I know that we'll be asking all our new friends here tonight about what they can do a bit later in the conversation, there's enough work to go around when it comes to trying to get constitutional change. And I think what we really need is very clear leadership direction, and for that leadership to be as collective as possible. And one of the things that really does disturb me about the way the politics gets played out is there's often a lot of debate and analysis in the media about, oh, well, it's going to require politicians to do this, and it's going to require Canberra to do that. It's going to require the states to do this. Given that, you know, we do have a task of succeeding with a double majority. No one ever stops to think about the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people went through the process that Dean outlined earlier without the same infrastructure and support to enable that collective agreement and struck agreement. We are a complex people, right? Reaching agreement, anyone who's ever done anything by committee knows it's not easy. Try and do it across the country with people who are culturally diverse and yet share the same political history of massive disappointment, betrayal, lies, theft of children, theft of land, theft of waters, blowing up artifacts, all of that sort of stuff. And then ask yourself, if a group of people can suspend, who've been through this, can suspend disbelief long enough to find a pathway that the majority of people will support, how dare the country, for political reasons, then decide it's too hard for them to respect and therefore support? I think that requiring consolidated leadership is a huge part of this, and ensuring that the right supports are in place to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to sustain that kind of collectivism, rather than asking different groups of people to come up with different solutions to the same question after elaborate consultation and over a decade now of deliberation and consideration, is farcical. And we really do need, I think, a reconsolidation, a reset that enables the Australian people to call all of the collective leadership, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, to that consolidated position that we can join and follow so we can get this work done.
Thanks, Tanya. Let me take you back to something you said a little while ago about dividing the movement. Struck a chord with me. It seems to me that we have, with the co-design process, the government saying, well, you know, we agree in principle there should be a voice, and then going out and consulting about that, but specifically excluding any consideration of a constitutional recognition of the voice, but somehow trying to persuade Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that they should accept this, that they should accept second best. And some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people thinking, well, we're never going to get constitutional reform, so maybe we should just run with this. That's what I see as the great divide. Would you want to comment on that? Driving a wedge is rather, I should put it. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think it's a tried and tested strategy that's worked many, many times. And it doesn't just work with Indigenous people. I think it works across a lot of sectors that can be divided. I think we see it playing out in climate change conversations. I think we see it playing out in a number of sort of areas of public discourse where there's a big problem and a big historical wrong to correct. I think that it's understandable that people will look at all of the options that are put. I can think of a number of workplaces I've operated in over my career where I'm pretty sure I've worked under people who've gone what I call black opinion shopping. And they'll just keep talking to black fellas until they get an answer they're comfortable with. And then they're just like, yep, I've consulted and I've got the answer. I think we see that happen. Having said that, we also have to expect that amongst our mobs, there are going to be differences of opinion about the best way to get a result. And so I hope my comments are not misunderstood to suggest that we're not entitled to have a different view about how we get to where we want to go. But I do think that when you look at the constitutional question in this recent iteration of work from when Julia Gillard put together the expert panel, that we actually have got a piece of work that's gone through a lot of rigour and a lot of debate, and there seems to be majority support across the country amongst Australians to head down this pathway. So I'm not sure what the value of seeking a different solution is, particularly when it's my understanding from the data I had access to back when I was at Recognise, that the Australian people are going to look to Indigenous Australians for a guide about whether to support what comes next. And if it seems that Indigenous people are not largely in agreement, then of course Australian people are going to wonder why we should invest the effort. And as an Indigenous woman, I would be questioning, why would we spend this kind of political capital on something we're not convinced of?
Yeah, that's right. But I do feel that there are some Indigenous leaders, some quite prominent, that feel quite worn down by it all and feel that we do need a voice. Indigenous people do need a say in their future. Maybe we should grab this because we don't see a government that's ever going to give us the recognition in the Constitution so it's a sort of a resigned or unhappy acceptance of something that's pretty second rate. Dean, I know you speak a lot about that, so we might just pass to you, and it would be good to hear a real explanation of why this is actually a third-rate solution, that is legislation on its own.
How you going?
Yeah, I think I just want to also pick up on the point that this is part of a pattern. The amount of times, not just on this question of constitutional recognition, but on previous efforts in the past, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in good faith put forward proposals for serious reform, have made heartfelt and very sophisticated requests for change, things like treaty, but the response tends to almost always be, it's like Jack and the Beanstalk going out there and saying, we want a cow, but poor old Jack comes back with a handful of beans every single time. Whether it's treaty and then getting reconciliation in return, or whether it's, constitutionally enshrined voice and then merely having to settle for a legislated voice. I think there's a sense of complacency in general that underpins the ability of, I think, the political class to think that that's acceptable. This sort of acceptance of mediocrity in Indigenous affairs is something that just pervades it. And it's not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the people that you talk about, Danny, I don't think there's a weary acceptance of it. I think there's just weariness that actually means that we live shorter lives as a result of having to do these things time and time again, shouting into the wind over and over again, and not getting the response that is that is a respectful response to those genuine calls. So I think me, as one of the sort of younger ones, relatively speaking, coming through, have an awareness of that. I'm starting to feel what that actually feels like in a very visceral, spiritual and emotional, physical kind of way in some ways, and feel like that this cause for a constitutionally enshrined voice by no means being the silver bullet that will fix everything for us, but will absolutely be a circuit breaker and a reform that allows us to lay a foundation for some of those other reforms, those that contain within the Uluru Statement and others that people are pursuing in different ways around the country. So, I think I'd just say that the reason why we're not going to settle for a legislated voice, and let me be really clear, we're not going to do that. This isn't going to be one of those processes where we just suddenly give up and walk away and say, that we accept this. There's been a number of people that have passed away since signatories to the Uluru Statement, people that mentored me in many ways through that process, who are no longer with us now already. This idea that we would suddenly give up the fight because a government or a parliament in unison, in a bipartisan fashion, potentially decides to legislate away our chance at a referendum on a voice, that somehow we will just drop our cause and calmly allow that to happen, I think needs reconsideration. We know that a legislated voice has no more protection and no more security than any of the other voices that have gone before. I'll be back here on more webinars in 5 to 10 years' time saying the same thing over and over again. In fact, I can write the report now, the analysis report that talks about why this next iteration of the voice has failed now, even before the possibility of it being legislated. I know what it's going to say because we've got those reports gathering dust on shelves around the country as we speak. So I just think we should just not do the same thing again. We should finally listen to what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people say. And as I say, the people get it. The people understand it. They understand, as Tanya says, the inherent, it is such a modest request. It's a very practical request, but an inherently modest request. And the people are up for it. So I think rather than dwell on what might happen if it's legislated, we're just not going to accept that as an outcome. So I think we should just focus on what's important and get a referendum up in the next term of Parliament. You're on mute, Danny.
Thank you, Dean. Of course, if it is just legislated, it doesn't have the muscular protection of the Constitution. It doesn't have the demand on our parliamentarians to give it the resources and support to make it work. Constitutional enshrinement, in effect, guarantees all of that. This can't be swept aside with the mere passage of ordinary legislation. And if legislation comes before constitutional recognition, then there is a grave risk that constitutional recognition will be kicked down the road. And what I would like, the question that I ask is that both parties are committed to constitutional recognition. The Labor Party is clearly given and confirmed on many occasions its support for constitutional recognition of the voice. The government has said it is committed to constitutional recognition. What I say is, if it's not constitutional recognition of the voice, what is it? What is the counterfactual here? And the answer is there is none. There can be no constitutional recognition of anything other than the voice. It has to be meaningful. And as Tanya has said very eloquently, if she was a Polly, she'd grab this with both hands and get it done ASAP. And Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have made it abundantly clear that they will not accept something that is merely symbolic of their presence in this country. That is just, the time for that has long passed. So I don't know, we're doing well on time, Liz. I just sort of throw to Dean and to Tanya. Do they have anything that they just want to add by way of expansion of what's been discussed so far? Tanya?
I think what I'd like to do is just acknowledge all of the incredibly hard work that has gone into this over the last decade and longer. All of the different people who've contributed to getting the work to this point, that there are just so many people. I think, given this is the first time I've spoken on this topic for a long time, I really want to recognise my colleagues and friends and family who were part of Recognise. We were often much maligned. I think one of the things about doing work like this and being in a role like the one Dean is in right now is that there are always people that think they can do it better. And they're very free with that advice. And I still get that advice in my day job now. And I enjoy it very much, don't get me wrong. I'm very grateful for all the unsolicited advice I receive. But, you know, I do want to recognise that to do work like this takes a huge commitment from people. And I think we're used to working hard to get change. And so there's nothing remarkable about that, but I think it's incredibly important as we're striving for recognition to recognise all of the efforts that came before. And that includes all the efforts that came before Recognise, all the efforts that came before the expert panel, and the generations and generations of leadership in this country that has forged a path and has helped create the sort of determination that Dean speaks to now, in terms of we're not going to wait for something easier. We're going to hold out for this, just like the great late Vincent Lingiari. We know how to wait. And yeah, I just really want to acknowledge all of those people who I had the huge privilege to work alongside, who made it possible for me to do my part of the job when I was doing it, and who are still there, ready and willing to play their part when we see the sort of momentum that is going to give us all the opportunity to vote yes.
Well said. Thank you for that.
I might just add, Tanya, just on your role in that, I've got the edges of it, I think, and slightly different campaigns, but your role in that is the reason why we are where we are right now, and is the reason why we're still in this fight. You're right. I think some have not dignified that, but I think it's worth noting that we wouldn't be here without the work, specifically your team, yes, but the work that you took on and the leadership that you took on in doing that. So I just do want to make that very, very small acknowledgement of an enormous job that you've done, and the foundations that you've laid for us.
Thank you for that, Dean. I think we now might go to question time.
So Danny, because one of the questions that I think most people are asking is, we've got quite a number of non-Indigenous people on the call as well. And what does it mean to be a strong ally? I mean, it was a gift to the Australian people. Every one of us needs to advocate and to do whatever we can to move this change agenda on. What advice would you have, maybe starting with you, Dean, and then to go to Tanya, for those who want to be strong allies to the cause?
I think it's very simple from my perspective. You have to understand that, and to pick up on Tanya's point before, of course, we've got different views in our community. We're just, in some ways, we're similar to other communities that have different philosophies and ideologies and political perspectives and ways about what's going to work and not going to work. And I always say, if we accept that diversity, we also have to accept where there is significant consensus. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is an absolute historic consensus. It doesn't represent every single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person. And if you're sitting around waiting for that to happen, for you to then act on a particular issue, I have to disappoint you right at this moment, that's not going to happen. So there needs to be a level of conviction and belief to be a good ally, in that what you are doing is something worth supporting. And I'd want to give you confidence that, as I said at the beginning, the Uluru Statement invited you. So you don't need to seek any further permission. You don't need to ask anybody else's view. Shop around for a different Black opinion, as Tanya said, because if you shop for 5 to 10 minutes, you'll find a different opinion that'll let you off the hook. It'll let you off the hook because you'll find that there's disagreement. Well, bad luck. There is disagreement, but there's significant agreement across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for this reform. And if this is something that you believe, I ask you to do it with conviction and belief. And when you have that conversation with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person that says, I don't believe in the Uluru Statement, I disagree with you, respectfully say, that's fine, but this is something that I want to continue to push as a supporter and as an ally. It's something that Danny has had to do on many occasions. And if you, we have to do it. We have to stand in those rooms and those conversations and have them. And so if you want to be there with us and be staunch with us as we push this forward.
Thanks
Dan.
very much. Tanya?
Sorry, what was the question?
I know, on allyship. how can people on this call be strong allies? And I couldn't agree more with Dean, but yeah, I don't know if you've got any particular messages there.
Look, I think just try to keep across what's going on. I think read the media, but read it with a analytical lens. Obviously sign up. I mean, I think when I was at Recognise, we used to say to people, the best thing you can do is just make a commitment to sign up 10 people and ask all of them to do the same. Because when it comes to referendum time, we're going to need arms and legs to play their part and help the country fulfill the mandate. So all of that work, it might seem like a small thing now, but it will come to great importance. And, that was one of the things that I learned from Tim Gartrell working alongside him at Recognise, is that you've got to get those names and numbers and email addresses. We have to build that army, that workforce of people who will help facilitate the country having a successful referendum. I think the other thing as well, I think back to the moments that I did share with the crew at Recognise, remembering just how important it is to just keep not taking no for an answer and being audacious. And I think that we need to remember that this isn't about a moment where some people get to have their name in the history books. That's not what we're working for. What we're working for is a moment in time that we can all feel proud of and know that we all played a part in. The inspiration was frequently the 1967 referendum. It was those campaigners, and knowing that the same sort of women that are part of the Jessie Street Trust were a huge part of that success, walking and working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think we've got that moment to look back to, that can inspire us to make sure that we create the forward momentum that's going to make this country better for everybody. And guess what? Blackfellas will benefit too, and it's about fucking time.
It is. Dean, what about signing up with the From the Heart? Do you want to just take people to that, what people can do there? I think you're on mute, Dean.
I've very conveniently for everybody changed my name here to exactly where you can sign up. So fromtheheart.com.au. Tanya's right. It's simple things. It is signing up. It's subscribing to our website. You'll get our newsletters as they come out. It's signing up and following our social media channels. Not only do you keep up to speed with what's going on with the campaign and the latest messaging and the latest sort of developments, but this is a real numbers game. And the more numbers that we can start to generate, the political parties have these magical machines that start working out when issues are popping up on the agenda through mentions, through references, through social media activity. And so it sounds like a really, sometimes get the look in the eye of people who go, I feel like I want to march down the street and I want to have the loud hailer in my hand and wave the flag and be there, getting arrested by the police. Well, that time might come, but until then, sign up, follow, and encourage your family and friends and your work colleagues to do the same, and keep the conversation going wherever you possibly can. We are 3% of the population. We can't carry this campaign by ourselves. We need you to help carry this conversation forward with us. So do the simple things, help us lay the foundations, and we'll build that. We'll continue to build the movement that's growing from there.
And it's about talking to friends. It's about talking to families. It's about participating in the arguments, advancing really the very powerful arguments as to why anything less than constitution enshrinement or a recognition of the voice. And it's not that complicated. It's just a short amendment to the Constitution, which in effect says there shall be a voice, and that voice shall permit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to advise the Parliament on such terms as the Parliament determines. It's not much more complicated than that. So I could use the same kind of language as Tanya did. What's wrong? What is so hard about this? For God's sake, get on the train.
Do it.
And you know, there's nothing better than the old-fashioned letter to the Prime Minister saying what's going on here. You know, we demand that this government take the necessary steps to take a bipartisan approach to this issue with the Labor Party and get on with the constitutional recognition of Australia's First Nations people in our constitution with the voice. So Liz, there you are.
Thank you so much, Danny, for such a wonderful conversation. And to Tanya and Dean, it's just been such a not just insightful, but also emotional conversation. And I think, you know, maybe there were some people who came a bit, you know, mixed feelings about this. I don't believe that you could have sat through this conversation and not be a strong ally in every way. And I just want to add one other thing that you could do, because supporting campaigns need funding to actually move ahead. So I just want to also say that if you're thinking of doing something, jump to From the Heart to financially support their campaign. They're really welcome donations. And I know as part of our Jessie Street Trust community, we seek to give financial donations also. So we see how much work goes into creating, supporting social change. We're all in this together. And I think there were some great suggestions there. So I just want to now hand to Tanya Plibersek, who has had such a strong commitment to constitutional reform. So I'll hand to Tanya just to make some closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Liz, and what a marvellous presentation from Tanya, from Dean, and so beautifully moderated by Danny. Thank you very much. Look, I'm pretty worried that a small group of angry, grumpy people are going to, divert the country from the direction it should be going in. And that angry, grumpy minority are the same people who told us when we passed national native title legislation that the Australian backyard was at risk. I think we've just had the Olympics, and most people can answer where they were when Australia won the Olympics, or when Kathy Freeman won her race, or, you know, these great moments in history. I look back on the bridge walk when hundreds of thousands of people marched for reconciliation. I look back on the national apology, and I think every Australian can remember where they were on those two big events as well, because we got at those moments a glimpse of how great our nation could be if we just accept this marvellous gift that has been offered to us. Dean spoke about the gift being offered to the people of Australia, and it's up to the people of Australia to make a decision about whether they accept this gift. I think that is so important to remember. This is not about governments and political parties that come and go making this decision on behalf of our nation. This is a decision that the people of Australia must make. So, Dean, thank you so much for reminding us that each one of us has a role in saying we accept this gift in the spirit in which it's intended. Tanya spoke about the desire that all of us have for belonging. And I think that desire for belonging is such a beautiful way of thinking of what is on offer here. Tanya spoke about her 14-year-old daughter and not wanting to wait forever until her daughter experiences the benefits that come with a proper recognition of the unique place of First Nations Australians in our national life. I don't want my kids to grow up to be another generation that doesn't have the sense or the integrity or the wisdom to accept the great gift that is offered from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I think even the title reminds us that this is a statement from the heart of our nation, the geographical and the spiritual heart of our nation. And it's really not until we accept, as Tanya and Dean have said, accept this gift and make it part of our collective story that we can really be whole as a nation. So it's just been wonderful to hear Tanya and Dean tonight, and to hear Danny moderating so fantastically. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. The Jessie Street Trust, we like to bring people together to discuss and support the sort of causes that Jessie Street herself would have supported. And I am certain from her role in the 1967 referendum that she would have been doing what Dean was saying we might need to do, which is getting out there on the barricades. All of us can do our bit, though. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks very much, Tanya. And we'll be joining Jessie, or we'll be joining each on the barricades as we move forward. So thanks to everyone for joining such a wonderful conversation. Particular thanks to our guests, Tanya Hosch and Dean Parker, and to our wonderful facilitator, Danny Gilbert. It's been a rich and moving, emotional, but also deeply committed conversation. And I look forward to welcoming our community of Jessie Street Trust participants back at our next webinar. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but we will once again put a national issue front and centre for debate and discussion. So have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.